So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about variables in JavaScript. So to begin, I'm going to create a new JS file, and I'm going to call it variables.js. And I'm going to comment out the other scripts that are linked to my index.html file. So I selected all, Control K C to comment it out, and now none of this code runs. And I'll do the same to script.js, so it's Control KC, and when you want to uncomment it, it's Control KU again after you've selected it all. So I'm going to save both of those now, so they are updated, and in index.html, I'm going to add a new script tag that links to variables.js. Okay, and save that. So let's get started. So in JavaScript, a variable is a bit like a container in which you can store data, or to be more precise, a value. So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable now. We start by using a keyword, and there's actually three different keywords we can use to create a variable. We can use the var keyword, we can use const, and we can use let. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about the differences between these later in the video, but first I'm going to create this using var. Now, after the keyword, we have to give a name to our variable, and when we reference it later in the script, we'll be able to access whatever's contained within the variable. So a variable name, it shouldn't contain special characters, and it cannot start with a number, and it should be written in camel case in JavaScript. So I'm going to call this variable here first name. Okay, and then I say equals, so that's it for the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, I can place a value there. And that value is what will be stored in the variable. So I could store a number in a variable. I could store a string value in a variable. So a name like Mark would work here. Numbers can also be used. I can also store, what else? Boolean values, so true or false. And I can also assign a value of null if I like, which means that there is no value here. So there are some other data types in JavaScript, but these are the main ones that you use in practice. So this is first name, so I'm going to store the name Mark, okay, because that seems most appropriate. Now, if I move down here and console log first name, you'll see that we log Mark to the console. So I need to open up the console here and refresh. And you see Mark has been logged on line 5. So we've stored Mark in the variable and called it on line 5. So if I was to just write Mark on line 3 without creating a variable, this would still return Mark, but I would have no way of accessing that value on line 5 because there's no way of referencing it. JavaScript has basically forgotten about it by line 5, but if I store it in a variable, then I can reference it. So JavaScript programming without variables is pretty much unthinkable because we'd have no way of accessing later in our code what we've created earlier in our code. We'd always be sort of programming on one line. So one more thing you should know before moving on, a variable stores the return value of the right-hand side if it's a one-line statement and it does return something. So the result of 2 plus 2 is 4. So 4 is going to be stored in number, not 2 plus 2 in this example. So I can go to my console and we should see 4 now. Okay. So we've just been logging to the console so far, but the nice thing about variables is we can use them later on for some purpose and also manipulate their values. So for example, if I wanted to create full name, I could say on the right-hand side, first name plus, and then I'm going to have a space there, so just an empty string, plus, and then let's say Smith. Okay, and then I can console log full name. And if I head over, you'll see that we've used the result from earlier and extended it a little bit. And with number, we could do a similar thing. So we could say var another number. Okay, and we could just say number from above plus 2 again, and we would get the result now 6 stored in the new another number variable. So I need to change the console log to another number, and you should see that in the console now. So that's 6. So that is the basics of working with variables. But what about the difference between var, let, and const? Because there are 3 different keywords we can use to declare variables. So var is the oldest and original way to declare variables, but it's got a few behaviors that we may not like. So first of all, if I create a new variable here, first name, and I enter a name there, now what's going to happen is it's going to overwrite the original variable and it's not going to throw an error. So unless we see it ourselves, we're not going to know that the original variable has been overwritten. So that's something we may not want. Another reason is that we can completely reassign the value. So now we're not creating a new variable, we're just taking first name and assigning a new value to it of Ted, but it's going to have the same result. We've overwritten the original value of the variable. Finally, when we create a variable like this, we create a new property on what is known as the global window object. So in order that it's really high, I'm just going to call it AAA. And then I'm going to call the global window object down here so I can see it in the console. Going to find that here and we'll locate it on this object. You can see AAA. Now you can see here there's loads of useful things on the window object, and these are all inbuilt. They come as standard with JavaScript. And I could actually overwrite one of these by accident. So I could say if I wanted my new variable to be called alert, okay, what's going to happen in the global window object is we're no longer going to be able to use alert. So I've only created a couple of variables here, but in a real project where you have lots of variables, the chances of something like this happening are higher. So to avoid these behaviors of var, in 2015, 2 new keywords were introduced for how we can create variables. So I would advise using const and let rather than var because of the reasons that I've mentioned. So I'm going to delete all of this and we'll start again now with const. Okay, so what I'm going to do is log the result of this to the console. Generally, I wouldn't advise you to name your variables after properties on the global window object, but I'm doing this just for demonstration purposes, what would happen if you did it by mistake. So let's see what that gives us. So we've got mark being returned by our first console log. If we open the global window object, we find that it hasn't been saved there, which is actually what we want. And even when we're not overwriting something, we're not polluting the global window object, which already has enough properties there built into it. Okay, so that's something nice about const, and let works in the same way. It will not save to the global window object. So then, what is the difference between const and let? So the main use case for const is when you have some data, for example, a name like this, you want to store it in a variable and you don't want the value to change. So the main use case for const, okay, I'm going to change this back to first name now. The main use case is when you have some data, want to store it in a variable and you don't want the value that you've assigned to that variable to change. So one thing you can't do is this. You can't create a variable without assigning a value to it. So this will throw an error. Okay, so you need to assign a value to it. And you also can't just overwrite that value with something else, okay, like we could do with var. So it's much more strict. So we have another error here. With let, we can do both of these actions. Okay, we could create a variable first name, and that wouldn't create an error. So we haven't assigned a value, but we have just declared it. So no error there. And we can assign a value to it like this, and it won't throw an error. Now with Const and Let, even with Let, which is more flexible, we cannot just redeclare a variable. So we can't say let first name here. Okay, we're recreating the variable, trying to create it again, and it's going to throw an error, and const would do the same thing. So at first it may seem a bit annoying that let and const throw more errors, but it can actually be a good thing when you're coding, because with var there can be silent errors. You can overwrite variables, you can overwrite properties on the global window object, and you can accidentally overwrite the original value of your variable. Let and const throw some errors for these kind of behavior. So I would advise using let and const. Use const when you want to create a new variable with a value that you don't want to change, such as a data object. And use let when you want a bit more flexibility. So for example, when you want to create a variable without assigning a value to it at first, or if you don't mind if the value you have assigned gets changed or overwritten later in your code.